The Fairfield County Courthouse in Rockville, Ohio, has seen many broken marriages, but few cases left such a bitter taste as the Harris divorce. On Wednesday, March 15, 2023, at 2:30 p.m., Judge Margaret Collins announced the final decision in case number 2022 DR 4847. Roger Harris sat on a hard wooden bench, clutching a worn baseball cap in his hands. 45 years of his life, 20 of which he had spent married to the woman who now sat 20 feet away from him, carefully avoiding his gaze. Cynthia Harris, née Wilson, looked different. A new haircut, brighter makeup, a dress he had never seen before. Even her posture was different, straighter, more confident. The defendant shall pay the plaintiff alimony in the amount of $750 per month. Judge voice cut through the silence of the courtroom. The house at 1247 Maple Street shall be transferred to the plaintiff. The defendant has 30 days to vacate the premises. Roger felt something tighten in his chest. $750. With his salary as a mechanic at Motors Plus, that meant living from paycheck to paycheck. And the house. The very house he had been paying off for the last 15 years, working overtime on weekends. The house where he had built the deck with his own hands, renovated the basement, where every nail had been hammered in with his family in mind. As for the minor daughter, Emily Harris, the judge continued, custody remains with the mother. The father is granted visitation rights every second and fourth weekend of the month, as well as 2 weeks in the summer. Emily, 18-year-old Emily, who would soon graduate from high school and go to college, whom he would now see 8 days a month. Roger glanced surreptitiously at his daughter, who was sitting next to her mother. The girl was looking at the floor, her long brown hair covering her face. Cynthia's lawyer, a dapper middle-aged man named Bradley Stone, whispered something to his client. Roger couldn't afford such an expensive lawyer. He was represented by Dave Miller, an elderly lawyer who charged modest fees and did what he could with limited resources. After the verdict was announced, Roger remained seated while the courtroom gradually emptied. Cynthia quickly walked past without looking back, and Emily hurried after her. Only at the exit did his daughter turn around and meet his gaze. Her eyes showed sadness, but also something else, perhaps relief. That evening, Roger sat in the garage of their house, now her house, surrounded by boxes of belongings. He was packing 20 years of their life together into cardboard boxes from the supermarket. Old photographs, fishing tackle, tools, books on auto mechanics. Each item carried a memory. Cynthia came out to the garage around 9 o'clock. She looked tired but determined. "Roger, we need to talk," she said, leaning against the doorway. He looked up from the box of old photos. In his hands was a photo of their wedding, young, happy, full of plans for the future. "What is there to talk about, Cynthia? Everything has already been said in court." "Money. Do you understand that $750 is the minimum I need? Emily is graduating, going to college." Roger slowly put the box down on the workbench. "Are you serious? Now I'll be renting a room from Jim Torres, eating macaroni and cheese, and you're thinking about how to squeeze even more out of me? Don't be dramatic. You have a good job." "A good job?" Roger turned to her. "Cynt, I've been working at the factory for 22 years. My salary after deductions is $2,500 a month. $750 to you, $200 for the room, $150 for the car, food, gas. I barely have anything left to live on." Cynthia crossed her arms over her chest. "That's not my problem, Roger. You should have thought about that earlier." "Should have thought about what?" His voice hardened. "That my wife of 20 years would decide she no longer wanted a family? Don't make it about me leaving the family. We both know there was nothing between us anymore." Roger sank down onto an old stool. She was right, and that was what hurt the most. In recent years, their marriage had become a formality. Joint accounts, parent-teacher conferences, routine questions about work over dinner. When he tried to remember the last time they had talked about something important or simply laughed together, his memory helpfully offered up a void. Listen, Cynthia softened her tone. I don't want to hurt you. It's just that I'm 42, Roger. 42. I want to live a little more, you know? To feel like a woman, not just a mother and a housewife. Have I been preventing you from feeling like a woman? Cynthia paused, searching for words. You're a good man, a good father. But everything between us died a long time ago, Roger. We just existed side by side. He knew she was right, but knowing that didn't make what was happening any less painful. How is Emily coping? He asked. It's hard. She's angry at both of us. She says we ruined her last year of school. Maybe we can... Roger stopped, realizing the futility of his words. What? Nothing. Just thinking maybe we're rushing things. Maybe we should try family therapy. Cynthia shook her head. Roger, the divorce is final. It's over. After she left, Roger was left alone among the boxes. He could hear the TV through the wall. Cynthia was watching some show, laughing from time to time. It was the kind of light, carefree laughter he hadn't heard from her in years. The following week, Roger moved in with Jim Torres. His colleague at the factory, Jim rented out a room in his house for $200 a month, a friend's discount. The room was small, with a single window overlooking the neighbor's yard. Roger put the boxes in the corner and laid the sheets he had brought from home on the narrow bed. The first month was the hardest. When he woke up in the morning, he couldn't figure out where he was for a few seconds. His hand automatically reached for the left side of the bed, where Cynthia had slept for 20 years. The evenings dragged on endlessly. There was no familiar sound of the TV from the living room, no voice of Emily doing her homework, no smell of dinner. His colleagues at the factory tried to support him. Jim regularly invited him out for a beer after work, and Tony Moretti offered to introduce him to his wife's divorced sister. But Roger wasn't ready to even think about other women. The first weekend with Emily was awkward. His daughter clearly didn't know how to behave with her father alone. They went to the movies and had dinner at Dennis, a local diner, where Emily ordered a salad and barely touched it. Dad, she said as he drove her home, I'm sorry it turned out this way. It's not your fault, sweetie, Roger replied, parking outside the house on Maple Street, the house that was no longer his home. Sometimes adults just grow apart. It has nothing to do with you. Mom says you'll both be happier. Maybe. Roger wasn't sure about that, but he didn't want to burden his daughter with his doubts. A month after the divorce, the first child support bill arrived $750 to be paid by the 15th. Roger sat at Jim's kitchen table, sorting through his bills: room rent, car insurance, phone, gas, food. After all the necessary expenses, he had less than $300 left per month. Maybe you should ask Stevens for a raise, Jim suggested, watching his friend's torment. I tried. He said the factory is barely staying afloat. Chinese competition, rising steel prices. What about a side job? I work at Carlos's auto shop on weekends, but that's only when there are orders. In early May, 2 months after the divorce, Roger decided to take a desperate step. He called Cynthia and asked to meet. What do you want to talk about? She asked. About us. About our family. Maybe we can try again? A long pause. Roger, I thought we had discussed everything. Cynt, I'll change. I'll pay more attention to you, to us. We can go somewhere, like we used to. Roger, stop, please. I miss you. I miss us. I miss the way we used to be. Another pause, even longer. Let's meet on Saturday at Starbucks on Main Street, at 2 o'clock. The meeting at Starbucks lasted only 20 minutes, but those 20 minutes changed everything. Roger came with hope and left with the feeling that his world had finally collapsed. Cynthia was different, not just different, but as if she were glowing from within. She ordered some fancy coffee with a name Roger couldn't pronounce, sat down across from him, and gently but firmly explained that there would be no going back to the way things were. I have something I need to tell you, she said toward the end of the conversation, twirling her half-finished latte in her hands. I'm seeing someone." Roger felt the world around him slow down. He had expected this. A divorced woman of 42, attractive, with a job, would of course find someone sooner or later. But so soon? "Who is he?" Roger asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "It's hard to explain. We met a month ago." A month ago. Even before the divorce was finalized. After that meeting, Roger couldn't work properly for 3 days. At the factory, he made mistakes he had never made in 22 years of service. Jim Torres took him home and silently poured him a beer, realizing that words were powerless here. Roger began to follow her. Not on purpose. He just sometimes drove past the house on Maple Street on his way home from work. Sometimes he stopped at Starbucks on the same street and watched through the window. He told himself he wanted to make sure Emily was okay, that Cynthia was coping. In reality, he was looking for signs of this mysterious man. He first saw Jason in mid-May. Roger was sitting in his old Ford across the street from the house when an unfamiliar car pulled up to the driveway, a red Honda Civic, about 10 years old. A young guy in jeans and a t-shirt with some rock band's logo got out. He was tall and thin, with a mop of dark hair and stubble. Roger watched as the guy climbed the steps to the porch. The door opened before he had a chance to knock. Cynthia, in a new dress, her hair down. She threw herself into his arms with such passion that Roger felt a physical pain in his chest. She had never greeted him like this before. Roger sat in the car for another half hour, trying to make sense of what he had seen. The guy looked young, very young. Roger was 45, and this guy could have been his son. The next day, he decided to find out who he was. Roger was a methodical man. 22 years of working in a factory had taught him to gather information piece by piece. He followed the red Honda to the Riverview Plaza shopping center, where it parked at Bernie's Burger Hut, a fast food restaurant that Roger considered to be food for students and teenagers. Through the glass window, he saw the same guy behind the counter, wearing a uniform with a name tag. Jason. Roger went inside and ordered a coffee, studying his potential rival. The guy was even younger than he had seemed from a distance. His movements were quick and confident, his smile easy. He was friendly with customers, but not overly so, professionally polite. "Anything else?" Jason asked, handing him a cup of coffee. "How old are you, son?" Roger asked the question before he had time to think. Jason raised his eyebrows in surprise. 19. Why? 19. A year older than Emily. 26 years younger than Cynthia. Roger left Bernie's in a state close to shock. His 42-year-old ex-wife was dating a 19-year-old boy. It wasn't just humiliating, it was absurd. What could they possibly discuss? What could they possibly talk about? This boy probably hadn't had a real relationship yet, was probably living with his parents and working for minimum wage. But the humiliation wasn't the most painful part. What was painful was how Cynthia looked in that guy's arms. Alive, passionate, the way Roger hadn't seen her in years. In the weeks that followed, the picture became clearer and more painful. Jason spent almost every evening at Cynthia's. His car was parked in the driveway until late at night, sometimes until morning. On weekends, they went somewhere together. Roger saw them loading bags and camping gear into the trunk, getting into the car, laughing and holding hands. Emily told him about it during one of their awkward dinners at Dennis. "He's been living with us for 2 weeks," she said, poking at her salad with a fork. "Mom says it's temporary, while he looks for another apartment." "How do you feel about that?" Roger asked cautiously. Emily shrugged. "He's okay. Young. Sometimes it's weird that we're almost the same age." "Is Mom happy?" "Very. She's completely different. She laughs all the time, buys new clothes, even dyed her hair." It was true. Roger had noticed the changes in Cynthia. Brighter clothes, a new hairstyle, even her gait had changed, becoming more confident. She looked 10 years younger. In June, the first serious conflict arose. Roger came to pick up Emily for the weekend and saw not only the red Honda in the driveway, but also a new car, a black Mustang, the latest model, an expensive car, very expensive for a fast food worker. Emily came out of the house with a bag and explained on the way to her father's Ford. Mom bought Jason a car. She said the old one was always breaking down. Roger stopped. Bought a car? Yeah, he drives her to work now, and on weekends, they drive his new car. Numbers flashed through Roger's mind. A new Mustang cost at least $30,000. Cynthia earned about $3,000 a month in the factory's human resources department. A good salary for Rockville, but not good enough to easily afford such a purchase, especially considering that she was raising her daughter alone and planned to pay for her college education. That evening, Roger called Cynthia. "We need to talk about money," he said without preamble. "What money?" "The car you bought for your boyfriend." A long pause. "That's none of your business, Roger." "It becomes my business when it affects my daughter's support. Where did you get $30,000 for a car?" "I took out a loan." "A loan? With our salaries? And how are you going to pay it back?" "That's my problem." "No, it's ours. Because if you have money problems, you'll start demanding an increase in child support." "Roger, end this conversation. How I spend my money is none of your business." But that was only the beginning. Throughout the summer, Roger noticed more and more changes. Expensive clothes on Cynthia, new furniture in the house. He saw it through the windows when he came to pick up Emily. Expensive restaurants where she and Jason went in the evenings. Emily told her father bits and pieces, not on purpose, just in the course of conversation. Mom joined a gym, an expensive one, with a personal trainer. They went to Columbus for a concert, in the VIP box. Jason quit his job at Bernie's. Mom said he doesn't have to work while he's applying to college. Each piece of information was like a blow. Roger was living on pasta and canned soup, buying clothes at Walmart, while his ex-wife was spending money on a boy who could have been her son. In August, the situation reached a critical point. Roger came to pick up Emily and saw that their house, his house, was being repainted. Professional painters were renovating the facade and replacing the roof tiles. It was an expensive renovation. Emily was upset. "Dad, I'm embarrassed to tell you this, but Mom asked if you could help with the money for my prom." Roger felt the blood begin to throb in his temples. "Help with prom? The dress, the limo, dinner? She says she's short on funds right now. Short on funds for home renovations and supporting her young lover." "Dad, don't." "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm not mad at you." But the anger was building. Roger began to sleep worse, and his colleagues at work noticed his irritability. Jim Torres tried to distract him by inviting him to the bar and fishing, but nothing helped. The same thoughts kept running through his head. She's spending money on a boy who could be her son, and she's asking me for help with her daughter's expenses. In early September, Roger decided to have a frank conversation. He waited until Jason left and went to the house on Maple Street. Cynthia opened the door wearing a new dress and with her hair professionally styled. Behind her, Roger saw the renovated living room, a new sofa, a large TV, paintings on the walls. "Roger, is something wrong? Can I come in? I want to talk." They sat down in the living room, and Roger looked around. Everything had changed. Even the smell in the house was different. More expensive perfume, new furniture. "Cynt, what's going on? Where did you get the money for all this?" "For what?" "For the renovation, the furniture, the car for the guy. You make $3,000 a month, I know your salary." Cynthia straightened up. "I can take out a loan, I can spend my savings." "What savings? We've never had much in savings, and loans have to be paid back." "Roger, this is my house, my life, my decisions. And my daughter, who's asking me to help with her graduation because her mother doesn't have the money." Cynthia stood up and paced around the room. "Fine. Yes, I'm spending money. A lot of money. For the first time in 20 years, I'm spending money on myself, on my happiness. On a boy who could be your son. On a man who makes me feel alive. At the expense of your daughter's future? Emily doesn't need anything, except a prom dress and money for college. The conversation became increasingly tense. Cynthia defended herself. Roger pressed on. At one point, she snapped. "You know what, Roger? I'm 42. 42. I've spent the best years of my life washing your socks and cooking dinners that you ate in silence in front of the TV. I deserve a little happiness." At my expense? At Emily's expense? You're getting what you're legally entitled to. Nothing more. What about your conscience? What about spending the family's money to support a boy? Jason isn't a boy, and what I do for him comes from the heart. Roger walked away from that conversation feeling completely betrayed, not just abandoned, betrayed. 20 years of marriage, a shared home, a daughter, plans for the future, all of it discarded for a 19-year-old guy from a fast food restaurant. In October, the news came that was the last straw. Emily told him during their traditional dinner at Dennis. "Dad, Mom's getting married." Roger slowly put his fork down on his plate. "To whom?" "To Jason. The wedding is in 2 weeks, at City Hall." "In 2 weeks?" "She said she doesn't want a big ceremony. They'll just sign the papers." Roger tried to process what he had heard. Cynthia, with whom he had lived for 20 years, for whom he had worked overtime, for whom he had built a house and planned a future, was marrying a boy she had known for 6 months. "How do you feel about that?" Emily shrugged, but her eyes showed her confusion. "I don't know. It's strange. He's only a year younger than me." "Well," Roger struggled to suppress the rage rising in his chest, "I wish them happiness." But he didn't wish them happiness. For the first time in his 45 years, Roger Harris felt true hatred. And that hatred grew with each passing day. The wedding took place on October 28th at the Rockville City Hall. Roger wasn't there, but Emily told him the details during their next meeting. It was a modest ceremony, just the bride, groom, and 2 witnesses. Cynthia wore a new white dress, and Jason wore a suit that, according to Emily, looked expensive. After the registration, they went to dinner at Le Chateau, the most expensive restaurant in town. "Mom was very happy," Emily said, but there was uncertainty in her voice. "It was just strange to sign the papers saying that Jason is now my stepfather. He's younger than me." Roger listened silently, clenching his fists under the table. Cynthia Taylor. His Cynthia now bore the surname of a 19-year-old boy. The first signs that something was wrong appeared in November. Layoffs began at the Motors Plus factory. Chinese auto parts manufacturers continued to dump prices, and large automotive corporations moved orders to Mexico and other countries with cheap labor. Roger had worked at the factory for 22 years, but that no longer guaranteed stability. Stevens, the plant manager, gathered the workers in the large workshop and announced restructuring, a nice word for layoffs. 20% of the staff had to leave by the end of the year. The selection criteria were productivity, versatility, and age. Roger realized that he was at risk on 2 counts. In December, his worst fears were confirmed. Stevens called him into his office on Friday, December 15th, at the end of the workday. "Roger, this is a difficult conversation for both of us," the director began, without looking him in the eye. "The factory is forced to reduce its staff. Your position is being eliminated." Roger sat in a chair across from Stevens's desk, on which lay papers with his name on them. 22 years of work fit into a thin folder. "When?" he asked. "Your last day of work is December 31st. You will receive severance pay in accordance with your employment contract and can count on a positive recommendation." The severance pay amounted to 2 months' salary. After that, there would only be unemployment benefits, which barely covered the rent for Jim's room. Roger drove home in a daze. 22 years of stability, predictability, social status, it was all over. At 45, With a mortgage and $750 a month in alimony, finding a new job with a comparable salary was almost impossible. Jim Torres met him at home with a bottle of whiskey. They sat in the kitchen, drinking and silent. What could be said? The economy was changing, factories were closing, jobs were disappearing. It was a reality that had to be accepted. "What are you going to do?" Jim asked after his third glass. "Look for a job, maybe in the next county, maybe shift work." "What about child support?" Roger twirled the glass in his hands. "I'll try to work something out with Cynthia." But when he called his ex-wife the next day, the conversation didn't go as he had planned. "I understand you're having problems," Cynthia said, "but child support is an obligation to your daughter, not to me." "Cynt, I lost my job. I need time to find a new one." "How much time?" "I don't know. A month, 2, maybe more." "Roger, Emily is graduating. She needs money to prepare for college, for the SAT, for the application. I can't pay for all that on my own." "What about your husband? Can't he help?" A long pause. "Jason isn't working yet. He's preparing to apply to college." "Not working? He's 19, he's healthy, and he's not working?" "He's researching programs, choosing a major." "At my expense?" "At my expense." The conversation ended with nothing. Cynthia was adamant. Child support must be paid in full and on time. January brought new problems. Roger was receiving unemployment benefits of $400 a week, a total of $1,500 a month. After child support, rent, and basic living expenses, he had less than $100 left. He ate mostly cheap canned food and pasta, buying only the bare necessities. The job search proved to be painful. In Rockville and the surrounding area, there were virtually no open positions for skilled mechanics. The few jobs he did find offered salaries 30 to 40% less than what he had earned at Motors Plus. Employers preferred young specialists who could be paid less. In February, Roger took a temporary job at a car repair shop in a neighboring town. The work was irregular and didn't come with benefits, but at least it provided some income. He worked there 3 days a week, earning $12 an hour instead of the $25 he had earned at the factory. Meanwhile, life at the house on Maple Street continued to become more and more luxurious. Emily told her father about the new purchases with growing embarrassment. "Jason bought a motorcycle. It's expensive, a sports bike. Mom says it's an investment in his future." "What future?" "He wants to be, I don't remember exactly, either a designer or a photographer. He says he needs to feel free to be creative." Roger learned more details from the neighbors. Jason had indeed bought a Kawasaki sports motorcycle worth about $15,000. In addition, professional photography equipment, an expensive sound system, and new living room furniture had appeared in the house. "Where did they get the money?" Roger asked Emily during one of their increasingly rare dinners. "Mom took out another loan. She says she's investing in our shared future." "Ours?" "Hers and Jason's." "What about you?" Emily shrugged. "I'm going to college soon. That is, if I can afford it." This became another source of conflict. Cynthia demanded that Roger contribute to his daughter's college tuition, but he barely had enough money to pay child support. By March, he had accumulated $1,500 in child support debt. Cynthia threatened to take him to court. "Roger, I understand your difficulties, but the law is the law. If you can't pay child support, the court can garnish your wages or seize your property." "What property? What wages?" "That's your problem." Roger began to notice that his behavior was changing. He started driving past the house on Maple Street more often, stopping and watching. At first, it was accidental. He just happened to be in the area. Then it became intentional. He saw how Cynthia and Jason lived. Late breakfasts on the deck that Roger had built himself. Romantic candlelit dinners in the dining room where the Harris family used to eat simple home-cooked meals. Jason rode his motorcycle, and Cynthia drove the new car she had bought herself in March. Roger found out about the purchase from Emily. It was a 3-year-old BMW, but still an expensive car. Cynthia explained to her daughter that she needed reliable transportation for work. "What about the old car?" "I gave it to Jason. Now he has both a car and a motorcycle." Roger sat in his old Ford across the street from the house and watched his ex-wife give cars to her 19-year-old husband, while she herself was barely making ends meet. He saw Jason leaving the house in expensive clothes, with the latest iPhone, getting into one car or another, depending on his mood. Gradually, watching became a ritual. Roger came to the house several times a week, usually in the evening, and sat in his car for an hour or an hour and a half. He studied their routine, habits, and schedule. Cynthia came home from work around 6, and Jason was usually at home. He never found a job after the wedding. In the evenings, they often went out, to restaurants, movies, or to see friends. Neighbors began to notice a strange man in an old Ford who often parked in front of the Taylor's house. Mrs. Gonzalez, an elderly woman who lived across the street, came out to the gate several times and stared intently at Roger's car. He knew he was acting suspiciously, but he couldn't stop. In April, an incident occurred that prompted Emily to openly express her concern about her father's behavior for the first time. "Dad, Mom says you're watching them." They were sitting at Dennis, and Roger felt himself blushing. "Watching? What does she mean?" "The neighbors see your car. They say you often park in front of the house. I sometimes drive by on business." "Dad?" Emily looked at him with sadness and concern. "Maybe you should talk to someone, a psychologist or—" "I'm fine." "Mom is worried. Jason is too. They think—" "What do they think?" "That you might do something stupid." Roger put down his fork. "Something stupid?" "Well, go to their house, cause a scene, or I don't know." "I'm not bothering anyone. I'm just driving around the city where I lived for 20 years. But Emily was right. Roger felt something dark and destructive growing inside him. Every day of unemployment, every dollar spent on alimony, every story about Jason's new purchases added to his rage and despair. In May, the situation got even worse. Jason decided he wanted to pursue music, and Cynthia bought him professional sound equipment worth about $10,000. The home studio was set up in the basement, the very basement that Roger had remodeled himself, dreaming of a family recreation room. "He's talented," Cynthia explained to Emily. "We need to support his creative aspirations." Emily relayed these words to her father, and Roger felt the last remnants of his self-control begin to crumble. "A talented boy is spending your mother's money on toys," he said to his daughter, "and you can't afford a normal graduation." "Dad, don't." "I have to. Someone has to tell the truth. Your mother has gone mad. She's ruining herself for a boy who could be her son." "Maybe they're happy? At whose expense? Yours? Mine?" Roger began to visit the house more often. Now he was there almost every day, sometimes twice a day. He studied their routine with the methodicalness of a detective. He knew when Cynthia left for work, when she returned, when they had guests, what cars arrived at the house. He saw Jason entertaining friends, young men and women who arrived in expensive cars, dressed in fashionable clothes. They spent time by the pool that Cynthia had installed last summer, barbecuing and playing loud music. Roger sat in his car and watched his former home turn into a place of entertainment for teenagers. Neighbors began to complain, not only about the strange man in the car, but also about the noise coming from the Taylor home. A young family with small children living nearby called the police several times because of loud music at night. At the end of May, Roger saw a scene that was the last straw. He was sitting in his car on Friday evening when an expensive delivery truck pulled up to the house. Two workers unloaded a huge TV, one of those flat screens that cost several $1,000s. Jason met the delivery men on the porch, showed them where to carry the purchase, and gave them a tip. He was wearing expensive jeans and a shirt and a shiny new watch on his wrist. Cynthia came out of the house, hugged her husband, and they went inside together, probably to admire their new purchase. Roger sat in his car and looked at the house where he had spent the best years of his life, where he had been a husband and father, where he had made plans for the future. Now that house belonged to a 19-year-old boy who was spending his ex-wife's money on expensive toys. That evening, for the first time in months of watching, Roger didn't just sit in his car. He got out, crossed the street, and stopped at the gate. Through the living room windows, he could see the huge screen of the new TV, on which Jason was playing some kind of video game. Cynthia was sitting next to him on the sofa, her head resting on his shoulder. Roger stood at the gate for a few minutes, then returned to his car. But something had changed in him at that moment. Observation was no longer enough. Tuesday, June 13th, began as usual for Roger. Up at 6 in the morning, a quick breakfast of instant coffee and toast, then off to Carlos's auto repair shop in the neighboring town. There wasn't much work, only 2 orders for the whole day, which meant about $40 in earnings. That was barely enough for gas and food. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Roger was done and headed home to Jim. On the way, he received a message from Cynthia's lawyer. It was brief and businesslike. Mr. Harris, the child support debt is $2,250. If payment is not received by June 20th, we will be forced to go to court for enforcement. Roger pulled over to the side of the road and reread the message several times. $2,250, an amount he couldn't come up with even if he sold his car. An enforcement meant seizure of property, wage garnishment, and possibly jail time for non-payment of child support. Instead of driving home, Roger headed for the house on Maple Street. He had to talk to Cynthia face-to-face, explain the situation, and ask for a deferment or a reduction in payments. It was the only way to avoid complete collapse. As he approached the house, Roger saw a familiar sight. Cynthia's BMW, Jason's Honda sports car, and his Kawasaki motorcycle were parked in the driveway. All the cars were clean and well-maintained, clearly serviced regularly at expensive auto shops. Roger parked on the street and headed for the front door. The house looked even better than when he lived there. Fresh paint, new flowers in the flower beds he had once planted himself, a professionally mowed lawn. Money, a lot of money had been spent to maintain this facade. He rang the doorbell and heard movement inside. Cynthia opened the door. She was home in the middle of the workday, which surprised Roger. She was wearing a house dress, her hair pulled back in a casual bun, but even at home she looked well-groomed and expensive. "Roger, what are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you, about money." Cynthia hesitated, looking at him through the screen door. "Now's not a good time." "Cynt, please, it's important." She sighed and opened the door. "Come in, but not for long." Roger entered the house and immediately sensed the changes. A new scent, expensive candles or air freshener. In the living room was a huge TV, which he had seen when it was delivered, new furniture, expensive paintings on the walls. Music was coming from the basement, probably Jason working in his studio. "Is Jason home?" Roger asked. "Yes, he's working on a new project." "Working? He found a job?" "A music project. Maybe he'll get a contract." Roger sat down on the new sofa, estimating its cost. Another few $1,000s out of the family budget. "Cynt, I got a message from your lawyer, a threat of legal action." "It's not a threat, Roger. It's reality. You owe more than $2,000. "I know how much I owe. But I can't pay. I don't have the money." Cynthia sat down in the chair opposite him. "Then find it." "How?" "I work 2 or 3 days a week and earn peanuts. There are no skilled jobs in this city." "Move to another city. Find a job there." "What about my daughter? I have to see Emily." "You already see her once every 2 weeks." Roger felt a familiar irritation rising in his chest. "Cynt, look around. New furniture, appliances, cars. You spend money like a millionaire, and you demand child support that I can't pay. How I spend my money is none of your business. It is my business when it affects my ability to pay child support. You are obligated to support our daughter regardless of my spending." Louder sounds began to emanate from the basement. Jason was apparently testing his new equipment. Drum beats, distorted guitar, attempts at singing, expensive toys at the expense of the family budget. "How much did you spend on his studio?" Roger asked. "That's none of your business." 10,000, 15, and the motorcycle, and the cars? Cynthia got up from her chair. "Roger, I think it's time for you to leave. We're not done talking." "We are. If you don't have the money, find it. Take out a loan, ask your relatives, sell something." "What can I sell? I don't have anything. You got the house, the car, all the property." That was the court's decision. Based on the fact that you allegedly don't have the means to support your daughter on your own, and now you're spending thousands on a boy. The music from the basement grew louder. Jason was clearly in a frenzy, experimenting with sound. Roger imagined him there in the basement he had remodeled himself, surrounded by equipment worth several months' salary. "How old is he, Cint? 19? He could be working, helping with expenses, instead of playing musician on your money." "Jason is talented. He has prospects." "Prospects? He's been living off you for 8 months, not working, spending your money on toys." "It's an investment in our future." "Whose future? Yours and the boys'? What about your daughter's future?" Cynthia headed for the front door. "Roger, leave. Now." "No." Roger remained seated. "I'm not leaving until we come to an agreement." "What agreement?" "Child support. Lower it to 500 or give me a 6-month deferment." "I can't." "You can. Your husband can find a job and help with the expenses." "Roger, get out of my house right now." "My house. I built it, renovated it, and paid the mortgage for 15 years. Cynthia went to the phone. "I'm calling the police." "Go ahead. Tell them how you're ruining your ex-husband by spending money on a boy." The music from the basement died down. Jason must have heard the raised voices and was listening. "Cint, I'm asking you one last time. Give me a break. I'll find a decent job and pay you regularly." "No." "Then at least ask your husband to get a job. Let him help support the household." "Jason doesn't owe you anything. But you owe it to your daughter, and to common sense." Cynthia picked up the phone. "I'm telling you for the last time, leave." Roger got up from the sofa. All the anger of the last few months, all the humiliation, all the pain of a ruined life rose up in him at once. "You know what, Cint? You've changed. You've become greedy and selfish. Get out! You're ruining our family for a boy who could be your son. Enough!" They stood facing each other in the living room, shouting. Cynthia held the phone receiver. Roger clenched his fists. 20 years of marriage, shared plans, a daughter, a home. All of it was falling apart in this room. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made them both fall silent. Jason was coming up from the basement, drawn by the noise. He appeared in the doorway of the living room, young, handsome, dressed in expensive clothes, with a look of bewilderment on his face. "What's going on?" he asked. "Nothing," Cynthia replied quickly. "Roger is leaving." Jason looked at Roger with caution and slight arrogance. "Are you okay, honey?" Honey. A 19-year-old boy was calling his 42-year-old ex-wife darling while standing in the house Roger had built for his family. "Yes," Cynthia said. Roger was just about to... She didn't have time to finish her sentence. Emily found her mother's body 3 hours later when she came home from school. The front door was ajar, which was strange. Cynthia always locked the house. The living room was a mess. Furniture was overturned, a vase was broken, and there were signs of a struggle. Cynthia was lying next to the sofa. Her eyes were open but lifeless. There were dark marks on her neck, indicating strangulation. Emily screamed and ran to the neighbors. Mrs. Gonzalez called the police and an ambulance, although it was already too late to help. Patrol Officer Dave Martinez was the first to arrive at the scene. He cordoned off the crime scene with yellow tape and called in detectives. The medical examiner confirmed death by strangulation. Detective Maria Sanchez arrived half an hour later. 48 years old, 20 years of police service, the last 8 in the homicide division. She was known for her methodical approach and ability to see details that others missed. Sanchez carefully examined the crime scene. There were obvious signs of a struggle, but no signs of robbery. The expensive TV, jewelry, and cash were all untouched. This pointed to a crime motivated by personal relationships. Emily gave her initial statement sitting in a patrol car with a blanket over her shoulders. She talked about her parents' tense relationship after the divorce, her father's financial problems, and his strange behavior in recent months. "Where is your stepfather?" Sanchez asked. "I don't know. When I left for school this morning, he was at home." "And your father? When was the last time you saw him?" "Last weekend, but the neighbors say they often see his car on our street." Sanchez wrote down every word. The case promised to be complicated. Family drama, financial motives, several potential suspects. But murders in small towns usually had simple explanations. She needed to find everyone who had access to the victim and a motive for murder. The search for Jason Taylor began immediately. His car and motorcycle were gone from the garage, and his cell phone was not answering. A bulletin was sent out to all nearby counties. Jason Taylor was found 18 hours after the murder at the Comfort Inn Motel in Toledo, 120 miles from Rockville. He was sitting in his room, staring at the wall, when the police broke down the door. He did not resist arrest and appeared to be in a state of shock. Detective Sanchez questioned him at the Lucas County Police Station before taking him back to Rockville. Jason looked much older than his 19 years, his face gaunt, his eyes red, his hands shaking. He smoked one cigarette after another, the ash falling onto the interrogation table. "I got home around 4, he said in a monotone voice. "Cynthia wasn't there. I thought she was at work. Then I saw the mess in the living room and her." His alibi for the time between noon and 4 o'clock was easily verified. Jason was at Guitar Center in Columbus, buying new equipment for the studio. He had receipts with timestamps, surveillance camera footage, and witnesses from the staff. Salesman Matt remembered him well, a young guy who spent $3,000 on amplifiers and effects processors. He was there from 1:30 to 3:30, Collins confirmed by phone. He chose very carefully, testing each unit for a long time. He paid with his wife's credit card. The drive from Columbus to Rockville took an hour and a half. Jason was physically incapable of committing the murder. Sanchez focused on Roger Harris. His motive was obvious and strong: financial problems, jealousy, humiliation. Over $2,000 in child support arrears and the threat of legal action could have been the last straw for a man who had been teetering on the edge for months. Jim Torres, Roger's roommate, confirmed that he had returned home around 6:30 p.m. on Tuesday. "He looked strange," Jim said. "Pale, anxious. He said he was tired and locked himself in his room. He didn't come out for dinner." Sanchez checked Roger's places of work. He was last seen at Carlos's auto repair shop around 3 o'clock. Carlos Mendez remembered that Roger was upset by a message on his phone. "He got a text message and got very angry," Carlos said. "He swore and said he had to leave immediately." The timeline was coming together. Roger could have left the auto repair shop in 3 days, reached his ex-wife's house in half an hour, committed the murder, and returned to Jim's by 6:30. But direct evidence was needed. Forensic investigators examined the crime scene with particular care. Clear fingerprints were found on the coffee table in the living room, which had been overturned during the struggle. A computer check showed a match with Roger Harris's fingerprints, which were in the database after his arrest for drunk driving 2 years earlier. Neighbors provided key evidence. Mrs. Gonzalez, an elderly woman from the house across the street, saw Roger's familiar Ford parked outside the Taylor's house around 3:30 p.m. "I remember the time exactly because I was watching my TV show," she told Sanchez. "This man has been parking here a lot in recent months. I was about to call the police, but I thought maybe he had a right to be here." Another neighbor, Michael Church, heard loud voices coming from the Taylor's house around 4 p.m. A man and a woman were yelling at each other. Then it suddenly went quiet. Sanchez found Roger the next morning in Jim Torres's room. He was sitting on the bed in the same work overalls he had worn the day before, having not slept all night. He wasn't surprised to see the detective, as if he had been expecting the visit. "Roger Harris, you are under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Cynthia Taylor," Sanchez said, taking out her handcuffs. Roger did not resist. He allowed himself to be handcuffed and walked silently to the patrol car. Jim Torres stood on the porch, shaking his head in disbelief. At the station, Roger refused a lawyer. He sat in the interrogation room across from Sanchez, his hands folded on the table, staring at the floor. His gray hair was tousled, his face covered with several days' stubble, his eyes red from lack of sleep. "Tell me what happened yesterday," Sanchez said. There was a long silence. Then Roger raised his head and looked at the detective. "I didn't mean to kill her." The confession was complete and detailed. Roger described receiving a message from his lawyer, visiting Cynthia, and arguing about alimony. He described how his anger had been building for months: unemployment, humiliation, watching the luxurious life of his ex-wife and her young husband. "She bought him expensive toys with my money," Roger said, staring at the table. "Motorcycles, music equipment, cars, and she demanded alimony from me that I couldn't pay." The moment of the murder occurred during a particularly vicious exchange of words. Cynthia called him a loser, said he had never been a real man, that Jason, at 19, was more mature than Roger at 45. "Something inside me snapped," Roger admitted. "I grabbed her by the throat. I didn't want to kill her, just to shut her up. But she kept saying horrible things and I squeezed harder." When Cynthia stopped moving, Roger realized what he had done. He tried to revive her, but it was too late. In a panic, he knocked over furniture, trying to make it look like a robbery, but he knew it didn't look convincing. "I just wanted her to give me a break," he repeated. "Just a few months to find a normal job." Sanchez finished drafting the confession 2 hours later. Roger signed each page calmly, without hesitation. It seemed that the burden he had been carrying for months had finally been lifted from his shoulders. News of the arrest quickly spread throughout Rockville. The small town was accustomed to family dramas, but murder was rare. Neighbors, colleagues, and acquaintances of the Harris family discussed the tragedy in stores, cafes, and gas stations. Emily received the news of her father's arrest at the home of her Aunt Carol, Cynthia's sister. The girl did not cry. She just sat on the sofa, hugging her knees with her arms, and shook her head. "I knew something was going to happen," she told her aunt. "Dad has changed in the last few months. He's become desperate." Aunt Carol planned to take Emily in until she finished school. The house on Maple Street was sealed off as a crime scene and then had to be handed over to the bank. It turned out that Cynthia had taken out several loans against it to finance her luxurious lifestyle with Jason. Jason returned to Rockville for Cynthia's funeral, but stayed only one day. Without his wife and her income, he couldn't afford the house, the cars, or his former lifestyle. He had to sell his expensive equipment to cover some of the debts. "I loved her," he told a reporter from the local newspaper. "I know people talk about the age difference, but we were happy." A week later, Jason left for California to stay with his cousin. He planned to start a new life, maybe enroll in a local college. A career in music seemed unrealistic without Cynthia's financial support. Roger was charged with second-degree murder. His court-appointed lawyer tried to negotiate a plea bargain, citing his client's emotional state and lack of intent. But the confession was too clear, the evidence too compelling. At the end of September, 3 months after the murder, Roger accepted a plea bargain in exchange for a sentence of 15 to 25 years in prison. He avoided life imprisonment, but at his age, it was practically a death sentence. Only Emily was present at the sentencing hearing. She sat in the back row, watching as her father was led away in handcuffs. Jason didn't come, and Aunt Carol couldn't get time off work. Emily enrolled at Ohio State University on a partial scholarship. She studied social work, planning to help families in crisis situations. Perhaps this was her way of finding meaning in the tragedy that had destroyed her own family. Once a month, she visited her father in prison. They talked through glass on the phone, avoiding any discussion of that day in June. They talked about her studies, the weather, and future plans that seemed unrealistic within the walls of the prison visiting room. Roger aged 10 years during his first year in prison. His hair had turned completely gray, his shoulders had slumped, and his eyes had taken on the emptiness of a man who understands that his life is over. He worked in the prison library, read books, and wrote letters to Emily, which she did not always answer. The house on Maple Street was bought by a young family from Columbus. They didn't know his story before they moved in, and by the time they found out from their neighbors, it was too late. The house was nice, the price was attractive. They repainted the walls and replaced the floors, but sometimes Mrs. Gonzalez would see the new owner's wife standing at the living room window, looking at the place where the tragedy had occurred. Carlos's auto repair shop closed a year after the murder. Carlos couldn't cope with the memories of Roger's last day at work, of how rage had taken hold of the man he considered a friend. He sold the equipment and opened a small grocery store on the other side of town. The Motors Plus factory finally closed in the spring of the following year. Chinese competition and the economic downturn made auto parts manufacturing in Rockville unprofitable. Hundreds of workers were left unemployed, and many families left town in search of a better life. Detective Sanchez was promoted and moved to a larger district. The Harris case was one of the easiest of her career, a classic family murder with obvious motives and a confession. But it haunted her longer than others because it showed how ordinary people can break under the pressure of circumstances that seem insignificant from the outside. The Harris family tragedy became part of the history of Rockville, a town that was slowly dying, along with disappearing jobs and crumbling families. It was a story of how jealousy, pride, and despair can lead to irreversible consequences that destroy the lives of everyone involved, without exception.